Beefalo Taming is one of the very few mechanics in this game that I genuinely believe is 100% OP. And here's why. Beefalo have 4 different forms, with each providing their own benefits and their own downsides depending on the chosen tendency. The Rider Beefalo gives you a speed boost, but a damage decrease, and it doesn't require any maintenance to mount it. While the Ornery Beefalo is probably the second most popular choice, with it getting a damage increase, damage resistance, but with the added downside of needing to feed the Beefalo before you actually mount it. The Pudgy Beefalo is probably the least popular, since it's just a passive sanity regen. It's slightly slower than average, and it poots on occasion. The default one is incredibly difficult to get intentionally, with most of the time people get them being on accident. It has average speed, average damage, and doesn't require food to be mounted, so it doesn't really have any of the downsides, but also doesn't have any of the upsides. Taming a Beefalo is something available to all characters and universally applies the same benefits across the board for the most part. All Beefalo are inherent speed boost, an effective plus 1000 HP, and an everlasting weapon with varying amounts of damage, most of which will cross over the ever so important 50 damage threshold with the right setup. So the question is, with all of these things being just pure upsides, why wouldn't you tame a Beefalo? Well, the first thing that people cite as the reason they don't tame a Beefalo is actually because of the process in which they have to tame them, which is pretty involved, but I'll try to break it down as best as I can. So when it comes to Beefalo taming, there are 3, but really only 2, things that you have to worry about. The domestication is just how far your Beefalo is, as far as fully becoming tamed. Full domestication is reached at a soft cap, which just results in your Beefalo no longer losing domestication passively, as well as the manifestation of a certain tendency. This isn't lost while you're riding the Beefalo, and it is gained while you're riding it and interacting with it. Obedience determines how long a Beefalo will let you ride it before bucking you off, as well as how close it gets to full domestication. This does require you to feed your Beefalo in order to gain favor for it, and it could also be boosted with other means, but for the most part, it's just going to be feeding it. Tendency is the Beefalo's affinity towards certain tasks or actions, divided between the aforementioned forms. This requires different tasks to be performed depending on each tendency, and each tendency has its own pros and cons. There isn't really a wrong option, but the 2 most popular are easily the Ornery and the Rider Beefalo. The 2 that you really want to pay attention to are the domestication, which is just basically a timer that tells you when your Beefalo is done baking, so to speak. And the obedience is something that will influence the buck timer, aka the time that you can ride it. These 2 can be calculated through an equation, but let's be real, nobody wants to do this equation that I'm showing on screen. Nobody wants to run their amount of time riding a Beefalo through this function every single time. They want to learn what their domestication is. So instead of doing that, I'll just refer you to the client-sided Beefalo buck timer mod, which is incredibly useful, and I'm going to be using it throughout this entire video. The actual process of taming a Beefalo isn't particularly complicated, despite the outline of it making it seem like it is. But if you're trying to tame a Beefalo, the quickest advice I can give you is just try riding it as much as you can whenever you can. And if you're going to do something that requires you to be off your Beefalo for an extended period of time, then make a salt lick or just use a saddle horn to get the saddle off of the Beefalo. And the salt lick will help keep its domestication up, or at least keep it standard. The best advice I can give is to just outline what I do when I decide to tame a Beefalo. When you're in a world where you decide to tame a Beefalo, the first thing you should do is just make a Beefalo bell. This will just make your Beefalo follow you as long as you keep the bell on you. And then just shave a handful of Beefalo. You're going to want at least 8 Beefalo wool just in case you need to make another saddle. After that, you just need to feed your Beefalo your choice of sticks, light bulbs, or alternatively grass. Me personally, I just favor light bulbs because they are easy to get tons of, and they're relatively inexpensive. Twigs are slightly better, as is grass, but light bulbs are just easier. If you have access to a crockpot already, then you could also use steamed twigs as your main source of feeding your Beefalo, but I digress. Then you're just going to want to ride your Beefalo as much as you can for as long as you are able to. Then anytime it would buck you off, just dismount it, feed it, and then get back on, and then repeat until it's fully tamed. Beefalo taming isn't too difficult, all things considered. It's just a very lengthy process that you can speed up by brushing it with a Beefalo brush, but that's pretty difficult to get early on. As far as trying to get tendencies go, there's some pretty easy tips on choosing your type of Beefalo. For a Pudgy Beefalo, you just need to feed your beef tons of steamed twigs, which you can make with 4 sticks in a crockpot until it starts farting. An Ornery Beefalo, you're going to want to fight as many things as you want, or, alternatively, You could just go into the caves, find a Snurtle or Slurtle, then just hold F until you kill 2 or 3 of them. The third one is if you want to be extra safe, but realistically, killing 2 of them while they're still in their shell, so just slamming them over and over again, will probably get you the Ornery perk. For a Rider Beefalo, you're going to want to avoid combat as much as possible, and just spend your time exploring so as to invest all your points into just riding it. Lastly, if you want a Standard Beefalo, well, this is going to get a bit more complicated. Standard Beefalo are notoriously difficult to get, but the best I could tell you is to stick it near a salt lake, treat it about 3 steamed twigs at the start of the day, then just keep doing that until it's fully tamed. Like, it's not great advice, but Standard Beefalo are incredibly hard to get, because you have to balance all its tendency points, which is really hard to do, since all of them are hidden stats. There are also a bunch of things that do affect the domestication process, such as if your Beefalo takes damage, then it's going to like you a little bit less for each time it takes damage. So, you know, just don't get hit. There's also the issue of feeding it food that it doesn't like. If you or another player hits a Beefalo, then that Beefalo's domestication gets reset by a ton. So, no matter what, never try to hit a Beefalo. One word of caution that I've kind of been skirting around is the fact that Beefalo do go into heat in different seasons. If a Beefalo is in heat, they'll aggro onto the player regardless of whether or not they're in the process of being tamed, and their buck timer will be shortened drastically. You can still tame a Beefalo during their heat seasons, but just make sure you're wearing a Beefalo hat to prevent them from aggroing onto you, and just try to be patient with them. Otherwise, plant them next to a salt lake and we'll try to wait it out. Obviously, this is a oversimplification of what the Beefalo taming process is, because this mechanic is incredibly complicated when you want to get into the weeds of things. But whenever I do research into taming Beefalo and I'm faced with a lot of that stuff, for the most part, it's just more confusing than it's worth. So I think just taking the simple process of ride your Beefalo as much as you can in the early game, feed it whenever you need to in order to get back on the Beefalo, and then just doing that over and over is a way easier way to conceptualize it, and it's probably just as effective, unless you have access to other things like, say, a Beefalo brush. So what's the point of the video? You know, why am I bringing all this up? Well, honestly, it's just something that I've had in the back of my mind for the longest time. Like, it's something that I've been thinking about because I've thought of Beefalo taming as being overpowered, and I do kind of stand by that. Beefalo taming is just a pure stat bonus, speed bonus, and weapon that never breaks, on top of a bunch of other benefits such as being able to carry statues across the map without having a single speed downgrade. And you know, all of that is super good, and there's honestly no reason not to tame a Beefalo, but other characters definitely benefit from it more than others. You know, Wolfgang, for example, benefits less from a Beefalo than Maxwell would, just because Wolfgang's perks are tied to him being in combat, and actively mining, chopping, and hammering things himself, rather than him doing anything in particular on a Beefalo. While Maxwell is on the complete opposite end and has minions that can do all that stuff for him while he's riding on a Beefalo, so he is greatly incentivized to do so. Initially, I was just gonna kind of skim over this segment, but then Clay came out with a new skill tree, and you know, wouldn't you know it, Wigford has perks that are Beefalo related, and I already talked about what I thought of them in that video, so go check it out if you haven't already. But it kind of made me feel like I should go more in depth with what makes Beefalo taming better or worse, depending on the character. The way that I think of these things is, are my character's perks and downsides remedied or enhanced through having a Beefalo? If not, then are they impacted by a Beefalo, or are they made irrelevant due to having a Beefalo? Wigford, for example, unfortunately falls into the latter. Wigford's perks include, but are not limited to, a damage absorption, bonus damage, lifesteal, and sanity regen on hit. None of these perks apply to the Beefalo that Wigford is riding, however. This means that there is more reason for you to engage in combat as Wigford without a Beefalo, and while you could just use the Beefalo to get around, at that point you're really going through the whole process of Beefalo taming for about 2/3 of the benefits, which for some people might be enough, it might be good enough, but in my opinion, it's not really worth it. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Maxwell, who's probably the best character to tame Beefalo as, since Maxwell's downside is basically just having less health than the average character, but it's completely negated by having a Beefalo, since Beefalo just basically add on plus 1000 HP. It's also a permanent weapon, regardless of what you have equipped in your hand slot. So, if you're Maxwell and equip something like the Shadow Thurible, That will boost your minions' damage significantly, and you will still be able to deal damage actively while you're riding a Beefalo. On top of all that, Maxwell can also read on top of the Beefalo, so there's very little reason to leave your Beefalo unless it's for things like opening chests or making food. It's incredibly useful on some characters, but not as good as others, and it really just depends on what your playstyle is, what the character kind of incentivizes, things like that. Now, I just went on and on about how OP Beefalo and how good they are, you know, all that fun stuff. But honestly, I kind of think they need a buff. You know, I'm in the camp that Beefalo taming is a process that is pretty lengthy and should be rewarded. But also, I understand that the power creep of the game, so to speak, is going in a direction where Beefalo are a bit less rewarding than they should be. With the introduction of planar damage, Beefalo naturally have less good options, since they have no means to deal or protect from planar damage. This, paired with the fact that it's not easy to de-aggro a Beefalo off of something, means that Beefalo tend to just wander into something like a Bright Shade and die. Speaking of, Beefalo can still die. You know, if your Beefalo dies after the full domestication process, that's it. There's no bouncing back from that. There's no way to revive a Beefalo, there's no way to like resuscitate it or anything like that. You know, once a Beefalo is gone, it's gone, and you just have to start the entire process all over again if you want those benefits. In fact, a lot of times, it's not uncommon for Beefalo to just die eventually. You know, shoutouts to the guy who called them Rollbackalo. You know, that's just rent-free in my mind now. Because, you know, Beefalo, whenever someone is taming them in a server, if it dies, people are pretty willing to roll back for it. Because I think everybody kind of understands how much of a commitment Beefalo is, and how much it sucks for a Beefalo to just die. Which isn't necessarily something I'm faulting the people who tame Beefalo for. You know, I get it, right? Like, I'm also in the camp where I understand that it's a whole season, if not a bit more, just to get this thing to, like, actually function as you want it to. And then having to go over it is just so much of a hassle. It's so demoralizing. So ultimately, I think if they're gonna change Beefalo somehow, the best thing to do to actually buff them is giving a way to revive it to just alleviate the stress of needing to maintain your Beefalo, or at least putting it on a cooldown of when it dies. So, for example, the Koalefant now has a corpse. You know, I don't know if anybody's done hunts recently, but that corpse kind of sticks around for a little bit. I think it'd be a cool mechanic if your Beefalo dies, you had, let's say, a day, maybe a day and a half, to go to its corpse and resuscitate it, just to save it. You know, it would still be, like, at pretty low health, and it'd still be at risk of everything. But I think that could be a cool mechanic that kind of alleviates some of the stress of owning a Beefalo. Ultimately, though, Beefalo is probably one of the strongest mechanics in the game. I think the perks that it brings to you cannot be understated. However, with the direction that the game is going, I do feel like they're gonna need a bit more moving forward. But I want to know whether or not you guys agree, because, you know, obviously everything about Beefalo is subjective. Some people do see the value of it. Some people kind of, you know, ignore it. Some people are like, who cares? It seems like too much work for me. Like, it's just always been in a weird spot in my head in the community where people agree that it's good, but people just choose not to do it for some reason. I don't know. They're really weird. That's all I really wanted to talk about. But yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about. So until next time, bye-bye.